seen now several times. I'm glad to see you all again. This morning, for those of you who were here at my morning talk, you'll recall that I was discussing things having to do with what might be called magic and liturgy and ritual and incantation and the worldly benefits of religious practices as well as the religious benefits of religious practices. The emphasis was on things practical and concrete. This evening we move in another direction and take up the study of Orientalism, which has a well-deserved but underappreciated reputation of being one of the more cerebral forms of Buddhism, with a strong emphasis on doctrine and doctrinal argument. And I'm going to talk particularly about one important theme in Hawaiian folk, the theme of the 6 marks, which I'll explain to you. Is that all right now? In the course of my remarks. Before we take up that subject, I'd like to start at some distance from. We're still having problems?
No, we're going to get it fixed. We just want to make it
Yeah. No.
Does this thing need to be adjusted?
Here, you want to bring it up?
Yeah.
Okay, right.
Here's some video. Oh, yeah, you can take over. It's not a slideshow, though. It's a Word document. So, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I want to begin some distance from Chinese Buddhism by quoting to you from a poem by an American English poet, known, I'm sure, to most of you, T.S. Eliot, who is not a figure usually studied by scholars working on Buddhism, but in fact has connections with Buddhism that some of you who have read his poetry may be familiar with. One of the great poets of the late 20th century, one of the great poets of the last several hundred years in any language. In his youth, he was a secular, irreligious person who, as he grew older, came closer and closer to Christianity and became, towards the end of his life, a very devout Anglican Catholic, high church Anglican Catholic. And in his later poetry, religious themes were especially prominent. This is a picture of the gentleman, as you probably guessed. And I'm going to quote for you a few lines from one of his later poems. He wrote a set of several poems called collectively the 4 Quartets. And the first of the 4 quartets is a poem called Little Giddy, which is the name of a chapel in England that he used as the background for this poem. And in this poem, there are themes which I think you will find, if I'm successful, anticipate or are remarkably similar to themes found in the Hawaiian text that I'm going to discuss with you. So just a few lines from Little Giddy by T.S. Eliot to start us off. Right? He tells us in the opening of this poem, what we call the beginning is often the end. And to make an end is to make a beginning. The end is where we start from. Keep that idea in mind when we come to the Buddhist text I'll be introducing. Later in that same poem, he in a sense repeats with variation that same theme and has this very compelling line. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Let's see, anything else? In another poem from the 4 Quartets, you find this line: time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and the time future contained in time past. And yet in another poem from that same collection, we have this single line, "In my beginning is my end." So this theme is repeated over and over again in T.S. Eliot's later religiously oriented poetry. Interestingly, although this poetry may seem far removed from Buddhism, T.S. Eliot, perhaps some of you know, was familiar with Buddhism. He was an undergraduate at Harvard in the late 19th century, and he studied with the monks, studied Sanskrit, and studied under the tutelage of a scholar at Harvard named Henry Clark Warren, who was a famous translator of Buddhist texts from the Pali language. His anthology of his translations from the Pali canon are still in print. And in some of T.S. Eliot's poetry, both his early poetry and later poems like these, you see allusions to sometimes very blatant, obvious allusions, in other cases subtle, hidden allusions to Buddhist themes, even though he was himself, and became ever more so as he grew older, a very devout Catholic Christian. So I thought I'd quote those two lines to you, those few lines to you, before we took up the text, which is our proper subject tonight. Let me see. Here we go. Now you've moved things for me. I don't know how to get out of this. Okay. This is the text we're going to talk about today. The text, the topic we're going to discuss, the doctrine of the 6 marks or 6 characteristics, is a doctrine found in many Huayan texts, in texts by Fazang, in texts by Changguan, Zhongmi, and later Huayan literature. It's one of the central themes in the architecture of Huayan thought. But this is a text that may not be as familiar to all of you who study Huayan Buddhism as those others I've just mentioned. It's a text by a Korean monk who brought Huayan Buddhism from China to Korea. I'll tell you his name and information about him in a moment. He was a student of the so-called second patriarch of Huayan Buddhism, the monk Zhiyan, who happens to be the monk on whom I wrote my doctoral dissertation. Right? He traveled from Korea to Tang Dynasty China, to the Zhiyan's temple in the Zhongshan Mountains south of Xi'an, south of Chang'an, and studied with Zhiyan during the last several years of Zhiyan's life. And under Zhiyan's tutelage, Zhiyan being, in my view, the man who really deserves to be called the first patriarch of Huayan, who sort of designed the fundamentals of Huayan Buddhism. Under his tutelage and in cooperation with him, he wrote this curious text. The title of this text, which you see on the screen, in Korean pronunciation of the Chinese characters, is Hwaom Ilsong Popke Do, right? A Chinese person would pronounce those characters Huayan Yi Sheng Fa Jie Tu, right? One can translate that title as Diagram of the Realm of Truth, which is how I'm translating Dharma Dhatu or Fa Jie here. Diagram of the Realm of Truth according to the one vehicle of the flower ornament scripture, the Huayan Jing, by the Korean monk Wisang, Yi Xiang in Chinese pronunciation. This is a text also known by another title, the Heian-do Poksong Ki, the Ocean Seal Diagram, Gatha, or verse of the Dharma nature. This is the author, as remembered in the Korean Buddhist artistic tradition. It's a kind of icon of Wisang, who is regarded as one of the most important figures in the transmission of Buddhism to Korea, right? And is regarded as the first patriarch of Korean Huayan Buddhism, Hwaon Buddhism, which he had begun to study in China. And there is an image of him seated at the feet of his teacher, his Chinese teacher, Zhiyan. Yisang lived from 625 to 702, and his Chinese teacher, Zhiyan, from 602 to 668. And this is a detail from the long medieval, early 13th century Japanese narrative scroll that some of you may know, entitled the Keigon Engi. And it's a visual account of the travels of Yisang and his fellow Buddhist Wonhyo in Korea and, in Huisang's case, to China. And here you see both his Chinese teacher and he together. There's a great deal of art associated with this figure and with his text, the text we'll be discussing. And these are two murals painted on the walls of a Korean monastery, which illustrate episodes from his life. The story goes that when he was studying with Zhiyan in China, Zhiyan asked him, who had, by the way, great respect for him as one of his most brilliant students, Zhiyan asked Yisang to summarize in a short text the essence of the Huayan Jing, the kind of task that teachers always assign their students. Take the Huayan Jing and give me a brief summary of it, he said. Zhiyan wrote a text of some length, maybe 2,000 words. He gave it to Zhiyan, who looked at it and said, the way teachers do, this is interesting, but it's too wordy and too obscure. Give me something different. So we're told that Yisang, obedient to his master, took the longer text that he had written and burnt it. You see it being burned in this image, right? And what was left when the fire died down was a much shorter collection of words, which he then organized in the form of the text that we have now, a sort of distillate of that longer text that he had written earlier, which in turn was a distillate, a condensation of the enormous Huayan Jing. That's the text we'll be talking about. And there's an image of it. It's somehow gotten upside down. I don't know how that happened. Well, I'll show you another example right side up. I apologize. There must be a way of doing this quickly, but I don't think I can. You'll see other images of this. This is a version of the text written, inscribed by a famous contemporary Korean calligrapher who was a practitioner of the art of sutra copying, written in gold ink in a particularly beautiful style, which he kindly agreed to allow me to use as the frontispiece for the book on this text that I've written and that will be published in the coming year. Right? His name, by the way, which I should mention, is Kim Kyung-ho. This text, the Popkedo, I'll use its abbreviated title, is understood to be a drastic condensation of the entire Avatamsaka Sutra, summarizing the key themes of the scripture as interpreted in the Huayan, or Hwaom, or in Japanese, Keigon school of East Asian Buddhism, and treating especially of that school's vision of the path leading from ignorance, desire, and suffering to the transcendent condition of Buddhahood. It's a Huayan text focusing particularly on what we might call soteriology, the process of enlightenment. It comprises 210 words that make up 30 7-word verses, or you could say 15 couplets, all arranged in the shape of a 4-lobed, maze-like or labyrinthine seal, vaguely resembling, as you'll see, a swastika. Let's see better images that are not upside down. Let's see. There we go. This is another version of the text, the same text but differently designed. And you can see its maze-like structure. The text begins in the center of this diagram with the word, I'm not sure you can read it, but the word fa, dharma, right? And is read through this maze-like structure until the poem, the 210 words, end back in the center of the diagram with the word, where are we? Oh, can I read this? Right? With the word for, right, underneath the word that began the series. Fa and for appear very near the center of this diagram. And I think maybe you'll agree with me that it looks vaguely like a swastika, although not exactly. I think it was intended to look a bit like a swastika. There are other examples of it here that you see, and the characters are more clear. I'll show you how this works in a moment. Let me show you a few more examples. You see it all over Korean Buddhism these days, and it's actually owing to the generosity of Korean monasteries. It's been returned to China, and you'll find this image in various modes now in China. Here's an example of it in Hangul, Korean script. Here's a rubbing of an early stone-carved inscription of the Popkedo. Here you see it on a stele near the entrance to a Korean monastery. This image is omnipresent in Korea. Another example, carved and written in stone, and then large-size versions of the diagram written in the form of a ritual precinct, constructed rather in the form of a ritual precinct, a sort of architectural version of the diagram, in which the maze becomes a series of corridors, and people can walk through that maze, beginning where the word fa appears, and ending upon return to the center of the maze with the word for. Here you see pilgrims engaged in that practice, right? And the last time I was in China at Dunhuang, I was surprised to discover in the reconstructed Leiyin-Si temple in the city of Dunhuang, there is a large plaza on the floor of which this same diagram is set out, that was a gift to the Chinese Buddhist monastery by Heian-sa, the famous Korean monastery, made a gift of this. Right? And there are many examples that can be seen of practitioners walking their way through the design of this text. Some of them you may make out here holding text, the text perhaps of this very text, or one of the wood blocks from the printing of the Huayan, holding it over their heads as they progress through the maze. This kind of practice, by the way, is not entirely unique to Buddhism. You see it elsewhere in the world. Some of you may have visited the famous Cathedral of Chartres in Paris. And in that cathedral is a similar or analogous maze, which people walk their way through in appreciation of Christian themes. Right? Here's the preface to the text, the beginning of it, which I've translated here. The excellent teaching of the great sage, the Buddha, is universal and diverse both in its responsiveness to the varying capacities of beings and in its suitability to their sundry maladies. The deluded, obsessed with mere traces and unawares that they have lost the essence, struggle endlessly to return to the source. The theme of return that we saw announced in the T.S. Eliot poem, the end being the beginning being the end, appears in this text. Therefore, relying on the principles and following the teachings, I have sketched out this circuitous poem in the hope that followers fixed on names will thereby find their way back to the nameless origin, true origin. And this is how it works. I mentioned it's comprised of 30 verses, and I've combined them into a set of 14 couplets, 14 words altogether, 15 couplets, each couplet comprising 14 words. And here you see where the course of the reader's eyes or the pilgrim's walk is followed. Verse 1, shown in the highlight here, I translate as, the nature of Dharma is perfect interfusion. Interfusion being, as you all know, a principal theme in itself of Huayan thought. Without duality, all dharmas are immovable, originally quiescent. Verses 3 and 4, nameless and formless, transcending all, this is what realized insight knows, nothing else. True nature is utterly deep and supremely subtle, detached from self-nature, formed according to conditions. In one is all, in many one. One is all, many are all. Each minuscule, each tiny mote contains the whole universe, another principal Huayan theme. And so it is also with all motes, with all minuscule items. Eternity is but a single instant eternity. The 9 times and the 10 times are one with each other, yet unmuddled they are distinctly formed. Theme being announced here subtly is the unity of oneness and multiplicity, right? With the mind's first impulse to awakening, one is already fully awakened. At the beginning, one has already reached the end, right? Samsara and nirvana are always united. Where principle and phenomena are Li and Shi, right, are mysteriously indistinguishable. This is the domain of the great ones, the 10 Buddhas and Samantabhadra, characters from the Huayan Sutra. Right? In Shakyamuni's ocean seal samadhi, miracles abound beyond reckoning. Treasures rain down for the benefit of beings, filling the skies, and beings attain benefit according to their capacities. Therefore, a practitioner's reversion to the source is surely impossible without quelling false thoughts. With spontaneous skill, he attains miraculous mastery and returns home to gain his allotted endowment. With a boundless wealth of dharani, right, he adorns the genuine jewel palace of the Dharmadhatu. I should pause at this moment and mention that when Wisang uses the term dharani, he's not referring to a magic spell. He uses the word in a broader sense to refer to any formula, including doctrinal formulas. A doctrinal formula like the doctrine of pratitya samutpada, dependent origination, is the kind of thing he will call a dharani in the doctrinal rather than the performative sense, right? In the end, installed in the seat of the middle way, the ultimate limit of reality, from which he has never moved, he is named Buddha. So those are the 30 verses making up the 210 words of this diagram text, right? Let me switch now to a different page of the text. There we go. And I'll read to you sections from my translation of the text. I've read already my translation of the 30 verses that are the foundation of the text. And those 30 verses and that diagram that you saw, which we'll explain in greater detail, is followed by a prose text in which Wissang himself comments on the meaning of those 30 verses. And in the course of those comments, broaches the theme, as we'll see, of the 6 marks. Let's see where we are here. The Popkedo as a whole, like the seal verses that are its core or foundation, is the product of careful design, and its meaning is conveyed by its form and its discursive architecture, as well as by its conceptual content. In other words, the meaning of this text is to be found not only in the words and sentences that comprise the text, but also in the very structure, the way those words are put together in this complex diagram. That's an important point to bear in mind. There we go. We're almost at the beginning of the translation here. Following the verses in that diagram is the prose text, which begins, "Let us now proceed to explain the text, distinguishing 2 approaches. First, a general explanation of the seal's purport. Second, an analytic explanation of its particular features." This diagram is called throughout the text a seal, as though it had been inscribed on what we popularly call a chop and imprinted on a page, right? And he continues, "Why use a seal?" he asks himself in this text. Why this particular design for conveying a summary of the Huayan Jing? Answer, because I wish to make it clear that the 3 worlds encompassed by Tathagata Shakyamuni's doctrinal system are manifest as profusely emerging from the ocean seal samadhi. The 3 worlds in question are first the receptacle world, the natural environment, second the world of sentient beings, and third the world of perfect awakening by insight. Those perfectly awakened by insight are the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. As this threefold world encompasses all dharmas, there is nothing else to be said. The full range of its meaning is as set forth in the Huayan Jing. I've offered comments on each portion of this text, and I'll quote to you some of those comments. Wissang here claims that the spiral or helical format of the seal, a design in which a multiplicity emerges from and winds its way back to a single center to which it will ultimately return, signifies that the manifold universe in all of its profusion is somehow born of the singular and potent identity of the Buddha's awakening experience. The world itself, in a sense, emerges from the mind of Shakyamuni Buddha. That experience is described as the attainment of a samadhi, the Sagara Mudra, ocean seal samadhi, in which all things appear in the Buddha mind like images clearly reflected or imprinted, as it were, on the surface of the ocean. This is to be understood not simply as a mirroring of how things are, but also as a metaphor for how things come to be. This transport, this samadhi, which the flower ornament regards as the most profound of all samadhi, is not only reflective but also generative. It produces what it manifests. It is perhaps not often enough noticed or sufficiently appreciated that samadhi of this sort imply the claim that the meditative transports of awakened beings are cosmically creative acts. Buddhas are here being credited as God is in biblical traditions, or as Ishvara is in Hinduism, with the power to create worlds. The conventional distinction between a Buddha and a creator God is thereby blurred. It is not, however, entirely erased. The world creation of a Buddha is a kind of phantasmal-like emanation of his own meditatively exalted mind, and the world he creates, as it were, within that mind. This is why we so often find in the art of Mahayana Buddhism, as well as in its scriptures, images and depictions of Buddhas bearing on their bodies imprints of whole worlds, sort of stamped on their flesh in the images. The creation affected by a Buddha is perhaps similar to that ascribed to Hinduism's Ishvara, but not quite like that of the biblical God. All right, the text continues, the analytical explanation. From the perspective of the seal's particularity, 3 topics are to be distinguished. First, we shall articulate its format as a seal. Second, we shall clarify the manner of its wording. And third, we shall explain the meaning of the text. Regarding the first of these topics, the articulation of the format of the seal, a question. Why is the seal patterned as only a single continuous path that winds its way around and returns to where it started, continuously, without break? Answer, to show that the Tathagata teaches with a single voice. By this is meant his singularly excellent skill in means. And why are there so many twists and turns? So as to be in accord with the varying capacities and inclinations of sentient beings. Just so does it benefit the teachings of the 3 vehicles. And why does the single path of the seal have no beginning or end? Why is it continuous, recursive? To show that the Tathagata's superlative skill is universal and that it is adequate to the whole Dharma Dhatu, wherein the 10 times are in perfect interfusion. In just this sense, it befits the perfect teaching, the highest teaching in the Huayan scheme of categorizing teachings, right? And why does the seal have 4 faces or 4 corners? So as to display the 4 inducements, the 4 immeasurables, themes from Buddhist practice. Such is the format of the seal because the idea is to reveal the one vehicle on the basis of the 3 vehicles. Huayan Buddhism identifies itself as the one vehicle, but incorporates into itself the so-called 3 vehicles. And Yisang is suggesting that the structure of this diagram, as well as the words in it, suggest the unity of the one vehicle, the incorporation into the one vehicle as a unity of the 3 vehicles. Right? Let's move on a little bit further. Second, clarifying the manner of the seal's wording. Question, why is it that among the words there is a first and a last? The word fa is the first in the series of poems, and the word for is the last. Why is that? Answer, to show from the perspective of the means of cultivation that cause and fruition, hetu and phala, right, yin and guo, are not the same. And how is it that among the words there are so many twists and turns? To make it clear that the faculties and inclinations of those in the 3 vehicles vary and are not the same. And why are the first and last words placed in the center of the seal? to show that in the Dharma nature tradition, that is Huayan Buddhism, the two orders of cause and fruition in their actual efficacy and in their nature both occupy the middle path. Such is the manner of the seal's wording. Next section here. We're getting closer to the theme of the 6 marks. Question. Above, it was said that cause and fruition are not the same, that the practice of Buddhism and all that's engaged in the practice, which will ultimately cause the fruition, the achievement of enlightenment, why is it said that they're not the same? Yet the true genius of the one tradition is to hold that in their natures, cause and fruition both occupy the middle path. And then he says, sort of confessing the difficulty of this topic, I have never understood, Huizong says, the rationale for making these two apparently contradictory claims, that cause and fruition, the practice of Buddhism and all that involves, and the attainment of Buddhism's end are distinct from each other, and yet in some mysterious way identical with each other. In one's beginning is one's end, as T.S. Eliot said. What does it mean, he says? And here he finds it necessary to quote another text, to quote a text by the Indian Yogacara master Vasubandhu, the author of a text called the Dashabhumi Vyakhyana, which is Vasubandhu's commentary on the Dashabhumika Sutra, the sutra on the 10 stages of the Bodhisattva career, which exists both as an independent text and as a chapter, a very important chapter in the Huayan Jing, right? Vasubandhu, a famous, one of the creators of the Yogacara system of Buddhist thought and practice, wrote a commentary on that particular text. And in that commentary, he speaks of, for the first time, what come to be called the 6 marks. So he says, however, relying on Vasubandhu, the author of the Dashabhumi Vyakhyana, known in Chinese as the Di Lun, or the Shi Di Lun, we will use the device of the 6 marks to set out its system of meaning. Following the logic of this notion, we can explain it part by part for an analysis of the 6 marks in terms of 10 lines in the Dashabhumika Sutra. See below. He talks further later on in the text about a particular 10 lines in the Dashabhumika Sutra where the theme of the 6 marks appears. Here, however, at this point in the text, availing ourselves of the figure of the seal to clarify the 6 marks, we will demonstrate that the one vehicle, Huayan Buddhism, and the 3 vehicles reciprocally constitute each other to display the system of dharmas. The 6 marks in question, he tells us finally, you're saying to yourself, right? The 6 marks in question are generality. These terms can be translated in a variety of ways here, but in this case, since I've chosen this translation, the 6 marks are generality, particularity, identity, difference, formation, and disintegration. Generality refers in this context to the fundamental seal itself, whereas the theme, the mark of particularity, refers to the surplus of twists and turns in the diagram insofar as their individual dependence upon the seal completes the seal. There cannot be a whole seal unless all of these parts comprise the whole seal, right? The diversity of parts somehow constitutes the unity of the overall diagram, right? There is, some of you may be familiar with this, a kind of a theme in modern philosophy, Western philosophy,
and also in classical Western philosophy, called mereology. Has anyone heard that term? Mereology, right? Mereology is the study of branch of metaphysics which discusses how wholes relate to parts and parts to wholes. And Wissang, as you'll see, is a kind of mereologist in this regard. He's talking about the relationship between the whole seal and the individual parts that make up the seal, the individual verses, the individual twists and turns in the course of the seal's construction. And later he'll expand that theme even further, as you'll see. The mark of identity is the seal in the sense that it turns, although each is distinct, in the sense that its turns, the turns that the path of the seal makes, its turns, although each is distinct, are yet one with the whole seal. Whereas difference is the theme, the mark of difference is the cumulative character of the seal, that is the succession of first turn, second turn, etc. Formation is the concision of the seal, its wholeness, its coming together of all those parts, its formation as a seal, whereas dissolution is the seal's expatiation, its twists and turns. Right. Let's see. Let's take a moment and move from this text, the actual translation, to, where am I here? Bear with me again. I'm going to see if I can navigate this quickly to the source from which Vasubandhu and later Wissang drew this doctrine. See where it comes from. If I can move here. Why is it disappearing? Forgive me. Here we go. Let me get to the place I'm looking for, and then we'll adjust the screen. All right. I've written an appendix to this text, which talks about those sentences in Vasubandhu's, in the Dashabhumika Sutra that Vasubandhu commented on, from which this doctrine is taken. Again, forgive me, where are we? I can't navigate with this way of doing it, hold on. If you could, we could compact the screen again, I can move more easily through the text. Right?
Is good enough?
Yeah, okay. Let's see, thanks. Okay. Yeah, let's see if there's a faster way of doing this. There we go. The origin of the, why didn't I think of that earlier? The origin of the 6 marks theme. The theme of the 6 marks, Liuxiang, is the product of an inventive translation of a passage in the Dashabhumika Sutra and of a series of eisegetical readings. You know the term exegetical, where you extract meaning from a text. The term eisegetical, a less familiar term, refers to the reading of meaning into the text. A series of eisegetical readings of that translated passage. The 6 marks would eventually come to have a metaphysical significance and would be used as a kind of template or overlay by which to read or analyze the cardinal Huayan doctrine of the reciprocal non-obstruction, the Wu-I, or complete interfusion, Yuanrong, of all things. However, it did not begin as a theme of such broad metaphysical import. Rather, as we'll see, it referred originally to certain aspects of the Bodhisattva path. All those who translated the sutra passage in question It was translated several times into Chinese by Buddhabhadra, by Shikshananda, and others. They chose essentially the same words to render the 6 marks. As is well known, the Chinese terms with some of their conventional translations of these 6 marks are again given here. Zhongxiang, right? Universality or generality or wholeness or totality or generic when used as an adjective. Biaxiang, particularity, individuation. Tongxiang, identity, sameness, unity, commonality. Yixiang, difference, otherness. Changxiang, formation, integration, accumulation. Huaixiang, dissolution, disintegration. Those are the standard renderings into English of these 6 Chinese terms. The first 2 have commonly been taken to refer to the relationship, respectively, of a whole, any whole, the relationship of that to its distinct parts. The other 4 of the 6 refer to the various relations among those parts. For example, the essential identity of all the parts insofar as they comprise a single whole, the differences among all parts when they are considered only as parts, the way in which parts come together to form a whole, the way in which each part of the whole yet retains its distinctiveness despite its participation in the whole, thereby serving to disassemble the whole. But so let's look at the original passage without the lens of later metaphysical interpretations. Happily, unlike most of the Huayan Jing, this chapter of the Huayan Jing, which I said also survives as an independent text, is preserved in Sanskrit. We have the original Sanskrit text, which I've given here and will translate for you from the Sanskrit. The highlighted line is the line in which the theme of the 6 marks appears. But here's a translation, fairly clumsy but literal translation from the Sanskrit. Text here is talking about the first of the 10 stages of the Bodhisattva and about the 10 vows that the Bodhisattva takes at that first stage. And that's what is being referred to here. Namely, in order to accomplish the arousal of bodhicitta, the aspiration for enlightenment, supported by the teaching as it is of the path of the stages, which is all the bodhisattva practices, wide, great, immense, indistinguishable, contained in all perfections, purifying all the stages, and then the key line, taken as a whole and in their parts, with common characteristics and with special characteristics in their formation and their destruction, supported by the admonition and instruction of purifying deeds of perfection, and supported by donation, I undertake the 4th vow of the 10 vows that the Bodhisattva takes on the first stage of the 10 stages, which is as wide as the Dharmadhatu, lasts through all future time, and is not brought to an end by any finite number of particular practices or by any finite number of eons. So these terms appear for the first time together in that one line from Chinese translations of that Sanskrit sentence. And I've provided here, but we won't examine it in detail, 3 different Chinese translations of that one passage from the Dashabhumika Sutra. They're all pretty much the same. There we go. Translating relatively freely from Bodhiruchi's version, with the key passage highlighted, we get the following. Now I'm translating the same passage from a translation of the sutra made by Bodhiruchi, who is one of the founders of what is called the Dilun tradition, one of the traditions of Buddhist thought that anticipated the birth of Huayan Buddhism. The founders of Huayan, like Huizong himself and his teacher Jurien, began their study of Mahayana Buddhism by focusing on the Vasubandhu's commentary on the 10 stages sutra, the 10 Bodhisattva stages sutra, And Bodhiruchi was someone who particularly focused on that text, Vasubandhu's commentary, creating what some scholars call the Dilun school of Buddhism, which is a kind of preface to Huayan Buddhism. Here it goes from Bodhiruchi's Chinese translation. Furthermore, he, the Bodhisattva, the first stage Bodhisattva, produces a fourth vow, quote, with all Bodhisattva practices, vast, great, immeasurable, unfragmented, contained in all perfections, purifying of all stages, giving rise to dharmas that support the path, expounding the true path of stages practiced by the Bodhisattva, undertaken as a whole and in their particulars, in their sameness and their difference, in their accumulation and in their dissolution, expounding the true staged path practiced by all the Bodhisattvas together with expedient actions of all perfections. I will teach and transform all, causing them to undertake the raising of the bodhicitta as vast as the Dharmadhatu, as extensive as space, persisting into the endless future, increasing unchecked by any finite number of eons or by any finite number of practices. Right? Okay. I wanted to show you where this doctrine, which is made much use of in Huayan thought, where it began. It began in a line in the Dashabhumika Sutra that if you just read the sutra itself and did not know what would come of it, what would be made of that line, you might just pass over it as another example of Mahayana Buddhist hyperbole, right? But this line captured the attention of Vasubandhu in his commentary, and the Chinese readers of that commentary were particularly taken with the 6 themes set forth in that one line of this passage and made of it a whole structure of doctrine. Let's see if we can say more about this by going back to the text. Let's see. Where are we? We'll see what further use Huizong himself makes of the doctrine of the 6 marks or 6 characteristics in just a moment, I hope. Right? Let's see. And we're getting close again. There we go. Almost there. So he's at the point in his commentary that he labels the explanation of the meaning of the text. The explanation of the meaning of the text. The text comprises 37-word sentences, 37-word sentences, arranged into 3 major segments. The first 18 verses among the 30 pertain to practice for one's own benefit. The next 4 verses pertain to practice for the benefit of others. The next 8 verses distinguish the practitioner's expedient means of cultivation and the benefits he gains. Right? Concerning practices beneficial to oneself. The first set of 18 verses is in 2 parts. The first 4 verses are the pair expressing realization, whereas the next 14 verses, 5 through 18, are the part disclosing dependent origination. He's using the set of 30 verses and their use in a diagram as a kind of map for the path of the Bodhisattva, for how these themes are to be applied in the practice of the Bodhisattva. Let me see here. And he gets to the theme of dependent origination, which is core central to all of Mahayana Buddhism, including the Huayan Jing. And in this passage he says, first we speak of the essence of dependent origination. This is the formula of the one vehicle. One is all and all are one. One verse among the 30. The Dharma of the Dharma realm without obstruction. Now let us disclose the meaning of dependent origination from this one perspective. As regards what is called dependent origination, the great sage, gathering all beings, would have them accord with principle and relinquish phenomena. Accord with Li and relinquish Shi. Ordinary worldlings see phenomena but lose sight of principle, whereas the sages, having attained principle, see phenomena as naught. So we now address true principle in order to understand deluded emotions, so that all sentient beings will know that phenomena are just nothing, and will understand principle as just this nothingness of phenomena. Thus, it is to propagate the teaching of the Dashabhumika commentary, Vasubandhu's text. It says in that teaching, the defining characteristic of a dependently originated worldly being is of three kinds. First is its defining character as effect, which is the co-arising of the, here I'm getting a little too complicated perhaps, the co-arising of the alaya vijnana, the storehouse consciousness, together with name and form. What he's doing, without getting too caught up in the technicalities here, he's trying to show how particular elements of the Bodhisattva's path form a whole, how the first of those 6 marks incorporates the second of those 6 marks, generality and particularity. Right? Let me see here. I'm sorry. Let's see. As you can see, I'm not an adept. No, not yet. Let me get, here we go. He finally gets to the theme of the 6 marks in this commentary specifically, and he says, what meaning is revealed by the 6 marks? Answer, they correctly reveal the principle of non-discrimination inherent in dependent origination. And so by this sense of the 6 marks, it should be understood that although the 7 scenes, 8 assemblies, assorted chapters of the Buddha Avatamsaka Sutra differ from one another, yet they all present in only the one chapter on the stages, the Dashabhumika chapter. They are all present there. How so? Because this root chapter encompasses all dharmas exhaustively rather. And although the 10 stages of the stages chapter differ from one another, yet they are all implicit in just the first stage. How so? because that first stage does not raise just one stage, but fully encompasses the merits of all stages. And although one stage has many parts that differ from one another, yet they all obtain in a single instant of thought. How so? Because the 3 times and the 9 periods are identical with a single instant. And as all are just one, so it is also with a single instant and many instants. As one is all, so a single instant is many instants, and vice versa. By virtue of this principle, doctrinal formulae, dharani in this doctrinal sense, reciprocally constitute one another. Whichever single dharma is raised, it exhaustively encompasses all dharmas. If one speaks in terms of the sutra's multiple assemblies, then each assembly encompasses all assemblies. If one speaks in terms of chapters, then each chapter encompasses all the chapters, and so on, even down to the words. Each passage or sentence exhaustively encompasses all. How so? Because without the one, the others would not come to be. Without the individual parts of the sutra and its narrative, the whole sutra would collapse, would fall apart. And as every doctrinal formulation is like this, so we set forth what follows. Here we go. Well, let me depart from this clumsy movement through the text and speak in general terms about this doctrine. It refers, when the 6 marks are first voiced by Vasubandhu and by these early Huayan thinkers, they're talking about the way in which the whole of the Bodhisattva path is both a unity and a diversity, right? And how it could not be one without also being the other, right? So that this becomes the sort of foundational principle on which is built the Huayan doctrines, that each individual phenomenon contains not only principle, the truth that applies to all phenomena, but all other phenomena. The metaphor most famous in connection with Huayan Buddhism, which in the course of his text Huizang will refer to, of course, is the famous metaphor of the net of Indra. This magnificent magical net, at each knot of which is placed a multifaceted jewel, such that when you look at one jewel in the net, you see the whole net reflected in it, along with each and every other jewel, a perfect and powerful image of the unity of oneness with diversity, right? Which is one of the uses to which Huayan in general and Huizang in this text put the doctrine of the 6 marks. And this is what used in connection with the theme of the course of the Bodhisattva's career. It's famous, one of the famous teachings of Huayan is that when you first enter the path of Buddhism, the Bodhisattva path, you have in effect already reached the end of that path. The end is implicit in the beginning, right? This is set forth repeatedly in Huayan text, in the sutra itself, and in almost all the commentaries on the sutra. And the early formulators of the Huayan intellectual tradition found a kind of code for this in the set of 6 marks that Vasubandhu had commented on in his commentary on the 10 stages chapter. Right? If you're looking for philosophical foundation, Buddhist philosophical foundation for this unusual Huayan claim that the one contains all and the all is contained in one, you can find it by reflecting on the way these different facets of the path of the Bodhisattva depend upon and enter into and incorporate all of the other components of the path. Right? how the beginning of the path includes its end, how the whole of the path includes its individual parts, how each of those individual parts, including even the beginning, contains the whole path and including even its end. Initially, the 6 marks doctrine was used as a way of, it was used for what we would call technically soteriological purposes. That is, to show how the path of the Bodhisattva's career proceeds. Later on, and it's mentioned in the text itself by Wisong, this same theme is taken out of the context of soteriology, the design of the path, and applied to what we might call Buddhist metaphysics, to the analysis of reality itself, of how all particular things are related to all other particular things and to the whole of every particular thing, according to these 6 perspectives, looking at how how the whole is identical with the parts, how the mark of generality is combined with the mark of individuality, how the construction of the whole is also its deconstruction, a marvelously inventive use of a set of themes discovered almost by accident in the Dashabhumika Sutra, and then having caught the attention of people like Vasubandhu and the early Huayan thinkers, being used for their own purposes in constructing the structure of Huayan thought in general. Particularly the claim that when you initiate the Bodhisattva path, when you first step on that path, you have in effect achieved its goal. That seems like a paradoxical, impossible claim. What is a path if it's not a process from one point of initiation to a point of culmination? Then the Huayan tradition says, no, the beginning of the Bodhisattva path, as though anticipating what T.S. Eliot said in his poem, in the beginning is your end. In your end is your beginning, right? A powerful insight into the way in which I think the Mahayana Buddhist path and the structure of Mahayana Buddhist thought, especially Huayan thought, insight into how that structure of thought is put together in the Huayan doctrinal imagination, how particularity and generality, universality and individuality, formation and deformation are all implicit in each other. Every aspect of the path implies, entails, suggests all other aspects of the path, so that what is called cause and effect, cause being practice, effect being the achievement of liberation, how they are actually not separate from one another, but how they entail one another, which I think is the underlying central theme of all of Huayan thought. All of the various metaphors that Huayan Buddhism constructs are based on this assumption, codified in the 6 marks doctrine, that the path is both a continuous whole and a collection of individual components, and they are ultimately the same in implying each other. I may have, in this rambling presentation, obscured the doctrine of the 6 marks, but I hope I managed to get some of it through. This text by Wisong is a brilliant demonstration of the subtlety and of the Huayan imagination. Imagine yourself being assigned a task like that which Wisong completed in the construction of this text. Right? You want to get, you're told you have 210 words, right? And you can put them together in 30 to make 30 verses. And now you're told to make a design out of those 30 verses, right? Which somehow suggests the dimensions of Mahayana, of Huayan thought. You begin by putting the first word in the sequence of 30 verses in the middle of the diagram. You want to have in the diagram, I haven't counted these for you, but there are 54 turns in the diagram. If you're walking through the diagram, you have to turn 54 times before you get back to the end in the middle. What does 54 mean? 54 refers to one way of counting the stages of the Bodhisattva path, right? And at each of those turns, you are engaged in one particular practice advocated by the Huayan tradition, but your purpose is to, as you proceed, reach the end of that practice, right? Now you're told, imagine you're a graphic designer and you're told, make an image that explains all of this. You've got 210 words, you have to put them together to 30 verses, you have to have a complex structure which has, is in one way a circle because it's continuous. You start and you end up where you started, but it's a crooked circle, right? It's got 54 turns in it, but it takes you back as an ordinary circle would do to the beginning. If you were on a pure circle and you started at one point and proceeded throughout, you'd end up back where you started. Here, you do the same thing in this, following this design, but with an appreciation of what the Buddhists call the theme of diversity. So this circle is sort of distorted by having 54 turns, reminiscent of the Bodhisattva's 54 stages of practice. Imagine being told, put this all together in the form of a design, right? And give it back to me tomorrow, Jurien said to Wisong, right? And it's an extraordinary feat of imagination to have done this, to have created this very complex but very symmetrical design, to have filled it with words that summarize the doctrines of Huayan Buddhism, and to comprise in that one sort of brilliant image a kind of summation of Huayan Buddhism. This is a text that is not so well known in the larger field of Huayan studies as a Korean text that did not receive in modern Chinese or Western scholarship the kind of attention that other Huayan texts have received, like the commentaries on the Sutra by Fazang and others. But it is a brilliant text that deserves much more attention than it has gotten so far. I hope that once my book is published in a few months, you'll all read it and see how important it actually was, right? I'm not happy with the presentation I've just given you this evening. It's probably a little too complicated and clumsy in its delivery, but I hope I've gotten across something of the extraordinary inventiveness and profundity of Huayan Buddhism as illustrated by this brilliant design and poem. So thanks for your attention.